Hey, Matt Sitter here, CEO of AFN. AFN, we believe that change is where opportunity happens, and the best way to find opportunity in change is a network that is diverse in experience, expertise, and perspective. That's one of the reasons why we bring subject matter experts together with folks in our community so that they can hear great things about different perspectives that are out there. Today, we've got Tom Bradbury with us. He is currently CEO of Broadgauge, and he's an advisor and investor with a number of different companies and was longtime CEO of Labrador Technology. Tom, awesome to have you here.
Thanks, man. I'm excited to be here.
Today, we are talking about culture and the impact in our organizations. Culture, though I once heard it described as that's just the way things are around here. But Tom, how do you define culture?
Well, after a lot of thumb wrestling with many different experts and the nuances that a lot of smart people, the different nuances a lot of smart people kind of incorporate into culture, I've distilled it where we describe it as shared values and appropriate behavior.
Okay.
I feel like that's something that we can all agree on on the essence of culture.
Okay, and this idea that that's kind of the way things are around here, are the shared values always explicit?
The shared values sometimes are documented somewhere, and less frequently they're consistently represented throughout an organization.
Yeah, I buy that. I buy that. Yeah. I once was working with Hewlett Packard, and they had, I think, a list of 10 values on the wall. And I don't think anyone could have said what they were, but they definitely knew what the real values were of the company.
Yeah. I mean, quite frankly, it's the values typically are communicated firsthand and secondhand by behavior and how those values are lived by leaders in any organization. That's what that's where a lot of people get their understanding of what's appropriate here within this organization.
And so when we think about, okay, so we understand the culture, we all feel it, we all get it in some way, shape, or form. And there is a lot out there on expectations of CEOs to be able to manage it. But when we're thinking about why we attribute importance to culture, what's the impact ultimately on the bottom line? How do we think about that and what it actually does for our organization's performance?
Well, it's a great question. It's the right question, Matt. I think, unfortunately, in the past and even to date, a lot of leaders don't think about the correlation between culture and the bottom line, right? So what's always been, and in many cases still is, a squishy topic, right? There's kind of two steps to get there and help leaders get there. One is bringing structure and being able to measure culture. And then the other is, how do you correlate those measurements to financial bottom line, indicators on whether your culture is supporting the business or driving the business appropriately. So whether it's where are we today and what are our financial indicators, and let's measure our culture. Now let's go make a difference and evolve our culture. And then having the right financial indicators tell us that what we're doing is we're getting ROI on the investments in what we're doing in and around human capital for culture.
What do you think are some of the most important indicators for us to zero in on?
Well, like any business, it's income or income per employee. But some of the things that we look at are a metric known as human capital ROI, which is the tracking of every dollar invested in the workforce. Of course, you can look at productivity, and in and around turnover and attrition, you can use accounting-based principled calculations to understand what the cost of attrition is, right? In total, which you can't wipe out all of your turnover, right? But you can improve it. So understanding how, and this is key for leaders, especially if you're a CHRO, right? And you want to communicate the importance of having a positive impact on your culture and evolving it, right? But also kind of providing the less squishy and more tangible information around with financial data that helps leaders make decisions on investments, which is, getting to a point where you can understand through attrition calculations that it's costing you X amount of dollars, right? And we can, in total, and then if we save a certain number of seats, you can use that same math that would support X amount of dollars back to the bottom line by saving a certain amount of seats. So recently with a healthcare company that we work with, we showed them through financial metrics and indicators how saving just a half a dozen seats could put more than a couple $1 million back to the bottom line, right? And what that does to financially literate CEOs is helps them understand, if I can put $1 million back to the bottom line by saving a half a dozen seats, how much of that couple $1 million am I willing to invest to get the rest back to the bottom line, right? You're providing them, right? The funding to make an investment and with a direct impact to the bottom line.
Yeah. Okay. So when we think outcomes first, I would say is one of the things that you're thinking about. And most of the things that you mentioned as measures, a lot of companies already have. They may have to do like a little bit of rejiggering on it, like the income or income per employee, like that's just division, right? Attrition, you've got that, or you should have that in some way, shape, or form. The human capital ROI, how difficult is it for organizations to arrive at that measure?
It's not very difficult. It's just placing it. That human capital ROI sits in this gap typically between employee engagement, which is not necessarily culture. It's a big part of culture, but those efforts that sometimes get over delegated to HR, there's some space between those efforts and what every company, as you said, are measuring or looking at from a financial KPI, financial metrics perspective, right? And there's some space, but we're not bringing those two together. And that's what I'm all about.
Right. Yeah. And I do think that, we do focus so much on these metrics already to begin with. So people are familiar with the metrics that we're trying to impact here. They've got them. When we think about let's say the cause on the cultural side, those things that we're measuring, that how are we breaking down culture into different pieces so that we can understand what are the dials that we want to spin? How do you think about breaking down culture into pieces?
I think about bringing structure to it in a way that, our metrics on our platform, that our North Star is, how do we resonate with senior leaders, right? Boards of directors, CEOs, and CHROs in a way where, as I said before, too often CEOs stay at arm's length from the culture and engagement conversation. They over delegate to very capable and smart people running and leading HR groups. But they're when I say at arm's length, they don't understand the reporting, the sometimes overly comprehensive data that comes back from most all platforms that are out there that become very people operational centric on meeting the day-to-day needs of employees, right? So you kind of create this space between a CEO or board of directors' ability to understand the data and what it's telling them. So for us, we want simple, elegant, practical, compliant-like metrics that help leaders understand two things. One is, where do I have to have a direct impact on culture as the CEO in such a case? And secondly, where do I need to help other culture stakeholders have an impact, right? What kind of barriers are in and around them within a domain of the business, a silo of the business, right? What's getting in the way of them having an impact across domains or down through their own domain, perhaps?
Right. Okay, so maybe if we just juxtapose two different roles as we're thinking about culture. So let's say CEO versus head of HR. How do you think, what are their roles in terms of fostering the culture, or even, let's just say, monitoring the culture?
Yeah, so that can happen in two ways. So you could have a middle market business, right? that's doing $800 million a year. And the HR leader has been brought in for their operational prowess, right? They're expert at the compliance side of the HR duties, right? And the CEO knows that they need to provide kind of a strategic overlay to the hard work that the HR leader's doing and kind of bring that together. On the flip side, you might have a very strategic and capable CHRO, big picture, and they were brought in for those reasons. And they need to better engage the CEO, because that's where you're getting approval on what you're sharing with employees from this is what we learned from an engagement survey, or this is what we're going to do, right? Getting the CEO to commit to being involved with that. So providing them not only the metrics that the CEO will understand and stay sticky to support the CHRO's initiative, but also tying to the financial indicators so that the CEO can have success in driving the business through the human capital, right? And have a better conversation with the CFO along with the CHRO on why you're going to make these investments.
Okay, so no matter what, CEO, they get to own culture in some way, shape, or form. There's no outsourcing of that. You can't say that's the HR person's job. The CEO has to be monitoring it, and they're either leading on it, it sounds like in some organizations, or the CHRO is actively engaging them against that. But in both cases, this has to be a priority that the CEO is focused on.
Yes. If you think about, in general, what we've been through over the last few years, you have many employees saying, what's right for me, right? And CEOs have to be deeply involved in the what's right for us and our business, our organization, and establishing that with and around the culture in partnership with the CHRO and board of directors in many cases, right? And then you're going out and shaping the culture to matter, right? In a way that matches what's right for us. Then the right people are on the bus.
How do you think CEOs are typically monitoring culture? Let's say, without Tom around telling us how we ought to be looking at some of these things, but how are they getting a feel for what's going on within the organization?
Well, I think a good way to answer that would be how the SEC for publicly traded companies in 2020 started to create regulation around human capital as hidden risk, right? Hidden risk for investors. Just like an example of hidden risk would be when Facebook's a handful of years ago, their stock dove because Apple changed the security in and around the iPhone and people being able to protect their own data, right? Investors didn't understand that could happen, right? With a policy change on an iPhone, right? That would have a negative impact on Facebook stock. The same way, think about culture or human capital risk. And the SEC is doing their best to create regulation so that over the next handful of years, that'll be something that publicly traded companies are going to have to be required to report in and around. And right now, how that's being done is most companies are just going to their HR leaders and saying, give me our engagement data, and let's come up with a way to present that, right? And every company's doing it differently. And there's a lot of customization there and, data that's subject to whoever's putting it together perspective, right? So there's not consistency and structure there. So, and I would say that as that improves and there's more structure and specificity around the requirements from the SEC, typically what happens is that the middle market and the private sector of the larger companies look at what's happening between these bigger publicly traded companies and their interaction with the SEC. And that starts to shape best practices for the middle market, right? And right now, it would be the same. What's someone who's CEO of a middle market company, whether it's private equity owned or is reporting to a board of directors, what are they bringing in around human capital risk? And it would be the same thing. They're kind of, in many cases, ham and egging it, right? Trying to get some data and lining it up with what seems to make sense for them, right? But it's being different. It's being done differently everywhere.
So you brought up engagement surveys, and I think that for a lot of years that was seen as like the silver bullet on how you measure culture, or at least like the solution on it. How far do engagement surveys get you on thinking about your culture within an organization, and what's the gap that is left?
Well, if done in a good way, the right way, you can use surveys to understand how you need to get better at surveying, right? Like, so taking the pulse. So we triangulate a few different things, right? So we have a client with high turnover. We have a client with sagging ENPS, Employee Net Promoter Score, which is calculated differently as part of the survey. And then we have culture engagement surveys, right? So there are three different inputs. And with one particular client, what we saw was their ENPS was super low. They had over 30% turnover, but their culture, their surveys, right, very high scores, right? And what that showed us, and we collaborated and started to understand some more interesting, scenarios within the business on why this happened to be a healthcare company, and the employees did not feel comfortable offering critical feedback during during the survey. So if you're triangulating with a few different points, you can start to understand, what has to be addressed. So for us, going back, our number one recommendation to them was you have to kind of inform and be transparent with the workforce that this is anonymous. We're not connecting it to any individuals, and we need this data. And when you get the CEO behind it, and we're connecting it to the financial metrics, right, or the costs associating with attrition or sagging human capital ROI, you're better positioning a CEO to go out and personally request from the workforce, right, better information. And as companies do that, you're going to get a higher rate of survey completion, and you're going to get better data.
Okay. Well, and so I think one thing that's pretty important there is that the engagement survey, it seems like a lot of the solutions out there are not necessarily making explicit the connection to some of those ROI metrics that we thought are really important. And it gets really easy to say like, oh, we just got to solve engagement, but that doesn't necessarily get you to what you're trying to get to on the ROI piece.
Yeah, and that's what happens. I mentioned earlier is the employee engagement data really gets focused in and around meeting the day-to-day needs operationally of the employee base, right, of the workforce. Super important. I'm not trying to lessen that importance. But kind of thinking about it more strategically as culture and the shared values and appropriate behavior, and getting senior leaders involved with, leader-centric data, right, and connecting it to the financial indicators is what's going to help businesses make the difference in the workforce and their returns, corporate performance.
Okay, so let's say we can make the direct connection between some of these metrics that are really important to us, like turnover and attrition, or income per employee, et cetera. What are the dials that a CEO can actually spin with respect to culture?
When you say spin,
if you want to make some changes, you're like, hey, all right, I think that we got a problem with the culture. I want to fix this. What is fixable, or what actions can you take around it?
Yeah, so you can and should be able to prioritize the actions that need to be taken or need to be addressed with the data that you get back. And quite frankly, what we see more and more, while there's definitely certain organizational risks that come out in measuring culture, like you have a significant diversity issue in a part of the business, and you should go out and hire an external expert, right, to come in and document that you kind of facilitated some training where that the diagnostic showed it was warranted or needed. But a lot of what we get back with our data is really internal programs that need to just be kind of the philosophy and mechanics need to be adjusted. So it's the change management of it becomes less onerous, and it's more a leader getting behind and supporting how we have to approach and do things differently.
Can you just give an example around that?
Sure. If I break it down and I start to understand that from a turnover perspective, where I'm getting hit the hardest is in a certain department that has a high impact on revenue, right? Now, you're then triangulating between senior leadership and what you see and working with the manager or executive in charge of that department. And you have the financial data to say, we need to save 10 more people than we did last year. That's our goal, right? And here you have that. If we know how much money, or we can start to say, this is the potential to go back to the bottom line based on that, you're able to work with that department leader and incentivize them or the people within that group to help make the changes. You didn't need to go out and hire an expert necessarily to come in and tell you what to do. That once the metrics are there and you start to understand the financial implications, it gives leadership the ability to work with more to make specific changes.
So we've been talking largely about culture holistically within an organization. And, we talked, that example was around in a particular department that you had higher attrition within this. How much can the impression of culture that people have within an organization vary from department to department? Or, how should we think about that?
That's a great question. We call that the variety of needs across the workforce, right? And what a lot of businesses do is kind of hold a bar, right? And say, we have to fix all of this, right? And you try to lift everything the same way, right? Try to change everything the same way. Whereas using the data, and remember those two key points I said, leaders understanding where they need to have a direct impact versus an indirect impact to help while helping other culture stakeholders be successful in making improvements. You understand where that changes and where that varies. So where there might be low CEO trust in the Toronto office, for lack of a better description, the CEO can make a decision to communicate better or more frequently with the Toronto office as an example, right? Versus San Francisco, where you need to help the CIO or CHRO be successful by removing some challenges or hurdles that are preventing them from making progress. So you start to think like how much more efficient leaders can be with the right metrics in addressing culture, right? And efficient in the investments you make, right? Rather than just going out and buying everyone a laptop and it costs you $10 million in laptops, right? There are higher priority actions that can and should be taken in most cultures that cascade down and might end up in better investments in technology.
Right. Okay. So one of the things that seems really important here is like, where are the focused opportunities that you can actually make changes in culture, and being able to identify those. It's like, hey, all right, your example of, we got a revenue producing group, they seem particularly high in attrition. That points us towards a goal that we're supposed to have. And then we could think about a budget that's around it, because we got a good idea on the ROI that's against it.
Correct.
And we don't have to think about boiling the ocean in terms of culture everywhere.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so this idea of having specific actions is really important. Hey, what can I do specifically to help us in the near term? It helps to have these goals that are out there. When you're thinking, let's say broadly from a company-wide perspective, what advice would you give CEOs in terms of how they are promoting the culture overall to the organization?
Well, it's a very simple formula, like the one on the back of all shampoo bottles, right? Lather, rinse, repeat, right? I hate to dumb it down that much, but we talk about measure, right? Where you're measuring culture and the financial indicators, right? Communicating, which is, informing the company of what you found out, what you see, right? With the appropriate level of transparency. And then demonstrating, right? Demonstrating by helping them see or understand that you're making investments based on what you're understanding they need and the business needs in order to move forward. So it's measure, communicate, demonstrate, right? And with the right data and the right level of engagement between leaders and human resource experts, and in many cases, boards of directors, right? Sticking to that formula, this incorporating a strategy for culture and human capital in this way in the business strategy for ongoing improvement. That's really it, right? So getting this framework where you get that cohesion between the right data points is what brings it together.
Great. Okay. And to circle back, I got one more question and then we'll open it up for other folks. So, this idea of, connected, we started out saying, hey, the ROI on this, it's really important to understand those metrics that are out there. And we do have a number of different CEOs that are in AFN that, may outsource some portion of their HR. They're not managing it all in-house. How do you hold, or how do you make sure that it is understood by your head of HR or by your outsourced HR that those are the metrics that you're trying to impact and holding them accountable against them? Because this isn't necessarily what's been asked of HR traditionally.
Yeah, this framework for the continuous improvement is the discipline is going to come from leadership, right? Because the biggest obstacle in many, especially in the middle market or in any specific area of a large global company, is that reaction to operational urgencies kind of knocks culture out of the box, especially when you're looking at it as a squishy,
right,
line item, right? So kind of setting the tone by subscribing, whether it be twice a year, 3 times a year, or 4 times a year, to active measurement, right? Where you're monitoring those financial indicators and the culture measurement continuously throughout the year, and every year having a mechanism of where, for a CEO, bringing that to the board, right? Baking that accountability in between the CEO and a board, right, is just as important, because that's going to drive accountability between whatever, whatever's in place from an HR perspective, internal stakeholders, as well as some external partners. Then it's going to necessitate that structure or infrastructure built through that that part of the business to bring it together. So yeah, you need a framework. And we're, for example, at Broadgauge, what we're doing is, selling annual accounts or annual contracts for multi-measurement, right? To get the CEOs and leaderships engaged in a cadence so that they're used to measuring and monitoring their human capital in this way.
And I lied. I got one more question for you. So what got you interested in looking at this cultural side to begin with? And how did you identify this as a challenge that you wanted to think about?
So when you mentioned I was CEO of Labrador Technology, I had this business that I started for 20 years, and what we focused on was workplace transformation. And we were a technology consultant within this real estate ecosystem that would take on projects that were initiated by a real estate transaction. My lease is up. I got to move. I got to stay. If I'm staying, I'm getting tenant improvement money, and I'm going to make my workplace nicer. Or if I move, I got to do this 2-year. And we went through many of these for some of the top companies in the world, Pepsi, BNP Paribas, many of them. And when I sold that business, one of the things I was kind of itching was that there was some commoditization around the approach to those projects that always kind of frustrated me as a business owner as part of it, and something that I wanted to take on. So I developed a methodology to go in and understand how tech and people were being productive together in these businesses. And my good friends at Cushman and Wakefield got a hold of me, and they took me on a few dozen workplace strategy engagements around North America where we partnered with them to do. And I just noticed that I'll I'll keep it clean. There was just so much stupid stuff that went on in these larger corporations, right?
Okay.
And it was
shocked
like
and dismayed.
Yeah. And, as a younger entrepreneur, I wanted to fix everybody, right? I now know I can't fix bigger companies. I can only help them. But it really, I had some time after exiting my business to think about what I wanted to take on next. And other than growing something that wasn't a consulting business, right? I wanted to figure out a product and kind of build something that I thought could bring value to the corporate world. So that got me on this track. And my North Star has been, how do we get leaders engaged with culture, right? Rather than over delegating it. And I think it's a two-way street. It's not me saying CHROs can't handle it, right? It's me saying if CHROs can do their job better if leadership is engaged appropriately. So getting them the right metrics and pairing it with financial indicators is going to help them care and help them see that they can and should be making a huge difference.
Awesome. Okay. So that's the portion where it's just you and me talking. I will open it up for questions from everyone else. Thanks so much for this.